Hi there! Last time you saw me finish with painting the inside of the hull. Now we're gonna put on the deck. And before we can fasten the deck, I will need to trim the edges a little bit and also repair the surfaces. To bond well, the surfaces need to be roughened. I sand with a 40 grit paper along the bonding edge and sand back the glass fiber edge so that it's straight. The edge was only cut with a knife when I did the surface layer, and the knife cut leaves a bit of a curved edge. Thus, as I prepare the surface layer, I trim the edge. The receiving surface also needs a similar preparation. Here I have no glass fiber on the surface, but I make some sand tracks in the epoxy layer and remove high spots on the surface as much as I can along the edge. The last preparation is to vacuum off the dust that I have generated. Preferable, I would have done the sanding outdoor, but it's cold and it was a short sanding work that I can finish now. Now I can check the fit, and after some fine trimming, I'm happy with the fit in both ends. So then I can flip the hull over and put the deck on from below in order to get better gluing. I will need some support here to get good contact. I mix up a batch of thickened epoxy and I start smearing it from the interior and outwards. When I have smeared the dividing bulkhead, I continue with the sides. On both sides. When all sides are smeared, I remove the elevation blocks and use some strip to press the middle section up. The day after I remove the strips and move outside. For some sanding. I remove the excess of the wood for later lamination of the rounded edge. I move around the edges on both sides. The hole on the bulkhead is a bit too large, so I prep the edges to be able to glue on an addition. I want to remove any paint and create some tracks in the surface. I will cut out a piece of plywood and draw a line that follows the hole onto the plywood. Like this. Then I cut it off and trim it to fit with the hole. This small piece will fit and cover the hole. There are some gaps around the edges that I will fill with some thickened epoxy. It's a bit cramped, but it works. Also here in the back compartment. After having extracted myself from the inside, I prepare the hole with a small plywood piece. I glass in the addition to increase strength. Now I can flip over the hull to take care of the top. Remove the tape preventing epoxy to drip out and start laying out the glass around the joints. This partly open gap needs some glass as a backing plate, and the rest of the gap is filled with very thick epoxy before I put on the glass strip. I strike the strip so it starts to wet out and conform to the bend, and take care of some trapped air. Similar procedure with the next section. I use the very thickened epoxy to fill gaps, and especially pre-wet the vertical side. Thickened epoxy holds the glass cloth well to the surface, but doesn't wet out the cloth as well as pure epoxy does. The joint between the deck and the tower also gets glassed in both ends. I use the last of this batch to pre-wet the other vertical side. Then I use less thickened epoxy to fill the gap along the edge. As this gap is sealed from the inside, there is no risk that the epoxy can pour down into the hull. I also use this batch of epoxy to wet out the cloth and glass in the rest. As I have thick epoxy under the glass cloth, I'm not worried that the epoxy will run down. I use the rest of the batch to cover the middle section of the deck. This section only has one layer of epoxy on it. Thus it's a good idea to use the excess to cover it well. Now I'm done with the deck. If you liked this episode, you might want to join me next time. And if you have any suggestions or questions, please feel free to leave a comment below. Viewer interaction is very much appreciated.